All right. Good to see so many familiar faces in the crowd. Great venue. For some reason, they gave Rob and I a full hour, and they gave everybody else about 15 or 20 minutes. So they must know we'll put some cool pictures that get people's attention. But I figured I had a few minutes. I just wanted to plug the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council. Thank you. The organization kind of stemmed out of a fire that we'll talk about in 1990. The Painted Cave Fire, as a lot of you may be familiar with, burned up about 420 homes, killed a person. The next year, 1991, was the Oakland Hills Fire. Killed 25 people. It started off as a tunnel fire. If you guys are familiar with the East Bay, Moraga, Orinda, ended up burning about 2,500 structures. And it got a lot of people's attention across the state about ways that maybe we could start improving ways of doing business. And one way they saw avenues for improvement was combining some of the knowledge that the civilians and residents had, because oftentimes the civilians and residents know their neighborhoods the best, and finding avenues to connect them with agency people like us. And that's what kind of stemmed the Fire Safe Councils. We started, the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council started in 1996. Ted Adams, sitting here in the front row, was part of that group that initially started it. The chief of Montecito at the time, Herb McElwee, was very influential. And it's been a volunteer organization for several decades. And just the stars aligned a few years ago. Max Moritz wrote a grant. We were able to hire an executive director, Anna Marie, who's been hosting it. And under her leadership, we've been able to hire about 4 or 5 additional staff. All are great. The people in green shirts are either our staff or on the board. We have a board of 13 people. We meet every fourth Thursday. After COVID, we turned it virtual. And every other monthly meeting is more of a general, everybody's always welcome, but oftentimes it's board business every other meeting. But the ones that are general membership, we try to get guest presentations. And a lot of us have a lot of relationships, and since it's virtual, we get people from all across the country to have anything to do about wildfire, fire ecology, evacuations, weather, things that are pretty cool. We're able to video it. So I just encourage you to go to the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council website. There's a lot of good information. We have an in-person meeting next Thursday at Direct Relief. Another professor from UCSB that's very familiar, been doing research about insurance. Obviously, people are interested in that. He's going to be presenting on that research. So just wanted to give a little bit of note to that. Okay, so like I said, I'm Nick Elmquist. I work for Montecito Fire Department. This is going to be my 25th fire season. The first 19 were with the U.S. Forest Service. Been involved with quite a few evacuations through the years. Last year, I'm on an incident management team. We were actually on the Smith River fire up east of Crescent City, evacuated the town of Gasky for about a week or 10 days. During those evacuations, there's a lot of meetings that are held, community meetings similar to this. And we're explaining to people, why they're evacuated, trying to give them updates. And it's a lot easier to give a good presentation when you're actually really familiar with the area, which I'm more familiar with Santa Barbara than I am of the Smith River drainage. So there's a few things I've learned through the years. One, evacuations are never perfect. Afterwards, you could always look back, and there's always a host of things that you could do better. And so I think that's something that everybody needs to remember, is that it's a very dynamic situation. Fires are very dynamic. There's a fog of war that occurs, and so there's going to be things that go wrong. Also, because of the dynamic nature of fires, it's going to be fairly messy, but the agencies are going to be overwhelmed. There's only so many fire engines, even with the mutual aid response. The Thomas fire was a little bit different once it started getting into Santa Barbara County, because there's weeks and weeks we had tons of fire engines, but oftentimes some of the fires we're going to be talking about, when you're having to evacuate now, fire agencies are going to be overwhelmed. So we're not going to be able to, agencies aren't going to be able to help every individual person. So I think the intent of Rob and I's presentation is not to give you hard and fast rules of what to do, what not to do, but to give you information, because you're going to have to make decisions on your own. And so hopefully after our presentation, you'll have some more information and you can make better decisions. So that's the intent of our presentation. All right, so anybody that's been around and knows about fire knows that there's 3 main factors that drive fire behavior. It's the topography, right? The weather and the fuel. And they aren't independent. They all kind of, in fact, influence each other. But we're going to go through each one and talk about why the Santa Barbara region has some of the most complex fires across the world, really. This is taken just east of Divide Peak, looking west along the San Ynez mountain range. I'm not going to get into the geography because I could count at least 3 UCSB geography professors here, and I don't want to embarrass myself. But this is called a transverse range, right, Alan? Yep, and it's transverse because it's crosswise, right? Most of our main mountain ranges run north-south, the Sierra Nevadas, the Rocky Mountains, for instance. But this is transverse. Our coast is south. There's only about a mile and a half from the coastal range, which is oftentimes much cooler, to the top of the San Ynez, and then there's a dramatic shift down to the San Ynez Valley with the temperature gradient, pressure differentials, and that causes some pretty unique weather patterns that drive and make our fires extremely complex, especially on the front country. This is just a short video to show just the really extreme topographic conditions that we face on the front country of Santa Barbara. So this was taken from some folks out of UC San Diego Scripps Institute that were doing LIDAR surveys of the front country. I believe this is the drainage just east of Painted Cave. That's East Camino Cielo off the top where they launched from. So this is sort of country you don't go in and put a fire out, right? We have trail systems. You know, the Jesucita fire started off the trail, but once you get a fire that's established in these mountainous regions, there's very little that you could do, especially under extreme fire conditions. So in terms of fire agencies, that's why when you get fires in these areas, and we'll talk about some of the weather patterns that drive them down into town, really we're going to be talking about evacuation, and that's what the intent of this meeting is. A bird's eye view. Well over 100% slope in most of those areas. You can see broken country, very rocky in a lot of areas. Chaparral is a vegetation type that we refer to collectively, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about fuels. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the weather. All of us know and love Santa Barbara County because our Mediterranean climate, right? One of the characteristics of a Mediterranean climate is our rain season is compressed within a few separate months. So this is a graph showing the water year. Starts in September. Very little rain, 1% really of our total rainfall of the year happens in September, and it slowly starts to increase. Really the bulk of our rain happens in December through March, a little bit in April, and then it pretty much shuts off right around now. And that happens almost every year, where it's just almost like flipping on a switch. Our rain's gonna turn off, and things are gonna start to dry out. This is last winter's rainfall across the state. You'll see the color hues, yellow and green are about 100%. The majority of the state saw above normal rainfall. We're one of the lucky ones down here. 2 good rainfall years, we needed it. About 150% in Santa Barbara County. This is from the Santa Barbara County Hydrology. Overall, about 140% of what was considered normal. But I also just wanted to point out how drastically different the annual rainfall is across different regions. So 57 inches up at San Marcos Pass, which was about 160% of normal. All right, we see some residents from the Trout Club probably in Painted Cave. But Cuyama, even though they saw 120% of normal, they only got 9¼ inches. So depending on where you are throughout the county really influences the rain. But the message is, you know, these last couple years have really been good in terms of increasing the groundwater in our reservoirs, obviously. So how much rain we get in the winter impacts our fuel conditions. All vegetation across the landscape that could burn can be broken up into 2 different categories: dead fuels and live fuels. Pretty simple. The dead fuels, we have these 4 kind of subcategories based on size. Raise your hand if you started a campfire. Almost everybody. If you haven't, you need to do it. Designate a campsite, you know, fire ring. Don't do it off some random trail. But as you know, when you start a fire, you start with kindling, right? You start with maybe gathering some pine needles and grasses, because those have the larger surface area to volume. They dry out a lot quicker, and that's what kind of gets the heat going. But they go out really quick. So you get some grasses, and you put some twigs on top. Those are the 10-hour fuels. Once you get a little bit of that established, then you get a little bit of the larger branches. And once you finally get a good heat base, you put on the oak logs. But you don't just go and put an oak log and try to burn it. So that's kind of the thought process when you're thinking about how fire burns. It's going to initially burn the lighter fuels. That's why a lot of our ignitions start along roadways and trails, disturbed sites where we get our annual grasses, because those are the driest, the most easily to ignite. A lot of times when we have years like this year, you'll hear a lot of the old timers say that's when you sometimes get some of your larger fires, because you have that grass fuel bed that really drives it up into our brush. The second picture is of chamise, right, Carla? Chamise? All right. And so this is going to determine, no matter how much heat you get going in that campfire, even when the oak logs are burning, it's very hard to cut a live bush and try to get that to burn. So it's the same kind of similar concept, right? That's why the time since last fire, what we call fire return interval, plays a big part in the intensity of the fires. The Thomas fire scar that's 6 years ago now, it's going to take a little bit for it to get enough of the dead fuels on the left to really be susceptible to burn. But when we start talking about concepts of evacuations, and if you have to seek refuge in areas, thinking about the fuel conditions of the areas where you're along your roadways that you're going to be evacuating, or within your community, just thinking about these concepts where there's lighter fuels, maybe they've been weed whipped. These are areas that are probably not going to see too much of an intense fire if you were to have to shelter in those areas. Okay, let's just talk briefly about the live fuels. This is from Santa Barbara County. They do live fuel sampling. They cut the chamise, which I just showed that last picture. They'll weigh it, and then they'll dry it out and weigh it again, and it gives you a percentage of how much moisture is held in that plant. And what I want to point out is that, 60% is what we consider critical. Almost always, we peak out around April or May, right around now. And this is regardless of how much rain we have. It may shift a little bit earlier or a little bit later, but you're always, because of the Mediterranean climate like we talked about, and the rain turns off, all those plants are going to dry out, even if we got 200% of rain in the winter. But come fall conditions, August, September, October, November if we don't see rain, or December like the 2017, those fuels are going to continue to dry. The live fuels are going to be critically dry come to the fall, regardless of what the rain was that last winter. So you could think about how that relates to fire danger. There's two main indices that we talk about when we're talking about fire danger. The BIs, which is burning index, and the ERCs, the energy release component, which is essentially just saying how much energy potential is at the head of that fire. So this is taken from the blue line is this current year. The gray is average. So because of the amount of rain we've had, we're well below average. This little green tail, it predicts for the next 7 days. So it's just showing that we're still, kind of in this even trend. But really, we don't start getting into our peaks until September, this gray line. That's when fire danger is going to be at the highest throughout the South Coast, us and Ventura, essentially. But the red line shows the maximum days over this climatological period since 2009 to 2022. That's what these graphs are based on. And what I just want to point out is there's always these days that happen in the fall where we get extreme conditions. So really, we need to be paying attention, right? From now, fire danger is going to start to increase, but really when we need to be heads up is when we get out of these, the marine layer pushes off, we're in September, October, and it's incredibly dry, our fuels conditions are the driest, and we'll get these, 2 or 3 day events where our fire danger are going to be about as high as they get throughout the year. And that's really when we need to pay attention. This is from another geography lab, Charles Jones at the Earth Research Institute at UCSB. They did 30 years of climatological data and just looking at the sundowner winds. As you guys all know, the sundowners are pretty unique. There are different areas of downsloping winds across the planet, really, but it's a fairly unique situation, and we get it here in Santa Barbara. And they broke it down into sundowners that affect the west transverse, so Gaviota. I live up north in North County, and I know come spring or fall, there's many times when you're driving through Gaviota and you get hit like a freight train right when you turn past the rest stop, right? When you drive that area, it blows a lot more frequently, stronger winds on the west side. But there are these events that happen throughout the year, but it's kind of bimodal, where you get strong events in the spring and then strong events in the fall. So hopefully you're starting to see how the fire danger, dry fuels, 5, 6, 7 months since last rainfall, and now we're getting sundowner winds on top of that. Why fires can get so extreme here in Santa Barbara County, and you need to be really heads up, especially in the fall time. This is just looking at some notable fires in the county, going all the way back to 1964. The Coyote Fire burned 106 structures, had a fatality. But I just wanted to point out, the Jesucita was an early season fire, May, but everything else is more or less June, and some of the most catastrophic and damaging were later in the year under those fall conditions. So just shifting gears a little bit and talking about how a fire burns. So all the fires have an ignition point, right? And if there's a wind, if there's no slope, it's going to follow the wind. Or if there's slope, it's probably oftentimes going to go uphill if there's no wind. Where it starts is always going to be referred to as the heel, and that's how you reference it. There's going to be a right flank going up the right side, the left flank going up the left, and the fire is going to be most intense at the head. So the flanks are going to be a lot cooler. That's why oftentimes suppression tactics, we get an anchor point. You anchor off the heel, and you could actually hopefully try to go direct, either with hand crews, helicopter, air tankers, and you're trying to go around those flanks and pinch the fire at the head. So you're slowly starting to squeeze the heat out of the fire. Just reference these spot fires out ahead of it. It's oftentimes going to be out ahead of the main fire because that's where it's the most intense. And you'll see it oftentimes burning in the lighter fuels. Like the Thomas Fire came all the way from Ventura County, hit the T fire scar in 2008, so it didn't have as much dead fuel to really get it going. But you would see if you look at a map of the little spots that it burned, a lot of where the annual grasses and the light fuels were, it wasn't intense enough to burn the brush, but it was burning the grasses that were dried out because it was December. We call the chimney effect, so paying attention to topography, right? Fire is going to want to burn up the hill, and the way that it's the chimney, it kind of condenses the air, dries out the fuels, heats it up out ahead of itself, and speeds it up. Generally, slope, for every 10% increase in slope, we see about a four times greater rate of growth, rate of spread of fires. So a significant influence that slope has on fire spread. So just thinking about the concepts when you're having to evacuate, especially a lot of our mountain areas. This is Tucker's Grove, looking up the 154. Look at all those confluences of drainages, how the 154 switches back, how many different variables, right? Depending on where the fire is coming from, where you are in relation to the fire. And this is the paint fire. So what's very unique under these sundowner conditions, and what makes it even more complex, is fires will burn down the hill. So the X is where it started up near the 154, and it burned all the way across the 101 down here towards Hope Ranch, because when you have winds that strong and that dry, it actually overpowers the slope, and that's what drives the fire. So just understanding the factors that influence fire spread and making those decisions when there's a fire, trying to figure out, where you are in relation to the fire, where's the wind, where's the topography, so that you could go the opposite direction. It also just points out, this is on East Mountain Drive, one of our residents, the importance of fuels management along our roadways. So thinking about all the concepts we've been talking about, Because not only are we going to be evacuating people out, but we're going to be trying to get first responders in, right? To anchor in and do all these suppression tactics we're talking about, protect the structures. So you could think about, even in extreme conditions, a really strong downsloping wind like the Thomas fire, it's going to be intense as it's up here in the vegetation, but there's going to start decreasing intensity once it starts getting out of that thick fuels. This has been type converted to grass, weed whipped, and so there's going to be a lot less intensity for people that are trying to evacuate along our roadways. And then you're able to bring equipment in, there's turnouts, there's a fire hydrant, and start to think about your suppression operations. Okay, so I just want to talk briefly about the tools that you have to understand the fire danger for the given day that you're in. I kind of gave you a good background, hopefully, that you're thinking about the seasonality of fire danger here in Santa Barbara. But you could go to any of our jurisdictional web pages, Santa Barbara City Fire, Montecito, Carpinteria. This is from Santa Barbara County. You'll see today's fire danger, low. This was just the other day. You'll also see around town a lot of fire stations will have signs with arrows, and that is just a representation, a physical representation of the fire danger that you see on the websites. So starting to pay attention. What's the fire danger today? Is it low? Is it moderate? Is it high? You need to start paying more attention. Is it very high or extreme? Maybe you need to fill up the gas. Start paying particular attention of the conditions. The Weather Service, the National Weather Service, is a great resource throughout the country. Go to their webpage, become familiar with it. A lot of people in our area are hikers and boaters and surfers. A lot of us are weather nerds. All fire people are weather nerds. But this is a great place, especially as you get into the fall, just to start paying attention to the weather conditions and understanding the environment so you could help yourselves. We've been very fortunate because of funding, Santa Barbara County Fire and the Fire Safe Council and a lot of the other jurisdictions have been really proactive in building these community wildfire protection plans. This is for the Santa Barbara Fire Safe Council website. Most likely, every single one of you reside in an area that is covered by a community wildfire protection plan. It will be very thorough to explain the specific hazards of your neighborhoods and give reasons or mitigation actions and give you specific information. So I recommend going to the Fire Safe Council. You'll see it. It'll be community wildfire protection plans. Find your area, read your plan. They're usually pretty thick documents, but there's a good table of contents. You could pick out what pertains to you. Okay, this is just a time wedge. Oftentimes we use it operationally to try to get people to be decisive and to understand the earlier you make a decision, right, the more time you have, the more options that you have. So you have more room, a margin of error. We talked about how it's such a dynamic situation. You can't predict what's going to happen. The more time you have, the more options. If you wait too long, you're going to have very limited options, and that's when accidents happen. There's a lot of people, we have this conversation about sheltering or staying and defending, to each their own. But I've seen a lot of fire professionals, right? We go to these large fires and you'll get city engines that come out and the fire's a week away and they feel super comfortable where they are. And you'll see those same people, in sticky situations a week later when the fire is actually on them because they don't have those slides. So that's just a little bit of information to think about. Is it's all fine and dandy under blue skies, but these conditions can change. You get a sundowner wind, and it's very, very extreme. So Rob will get more into the details about the evacuation specific and fire behavior under these conditions. But I just wanted to kind of segue into Rob's talk, hopefully. All right, so this is in 2008, the T fire just above Westmont. Just to give you a slide of the conditions that we see when all these extreme conditions align and you get a wildfire that then starts getting into an urban conflagration. This is not an area where you want to be conducting rescues, right? It's an area that you want to hopefully have everybody already evacuated and you're doing point protection and trying to save what you can and waiting for the conditions to change. So I'm going to bring up Rob to talk more about the evacuation-specific information. Thanks.
All right. So that previous little video clip is pretty intense and probably represents the most extreme situation that you'd be faced with, but we've actually seen that quite a bit on the Santa Barbara South Coast. So a little bit about myself, Rob Hazard. I just retired from 36 years in the fire service. Thank you. The last 26 was with Santa Barbara County Fire, and before that, I worked with the Forest Service on our local hotshot crew for 10 years. And actually, in my third year on the hotshot crew was the Painted Cave Fire. So that was my introduction to this type of urban interface fire that requires huge evacuations. And I'll readily admit, when Anne Marie hit me up to be part of this presentation, it wasn't like my favorite subject to talk about evacuation. For 36 years, I'm always running to the fire. That's my natural inclination. I actually feel sort of a sense of familiarity with fire and kind of almost that strange sort of adrenaline thing that wildland firefighters have. So I feel very comfortable with wildland fire, not that I haven't had nervous moments, but yeah, it was always a running to the fire. Not to mention, I also grew up out on the Gaviota coast on a rural piece of property a long ways from any fire stations. And my family, my father in particular, would always tell me as a young kid, we're not going to evacuate. And he'd take me out in the yard and go, here's this fire hose and turn this sprinkler on and go, run around and wet all this down. And so as a kid, I had this whole drill in my head. So my family's version of ready, set, go was actually ready, set, stay, fight the fire. So that in my head was a factor for many, many, many years. And, you know, this kind of follows what happened sort of broadly across a lot of different jurisdictions and countries that were dealing with wildland fire evacuation and what the best policy would look like. And so this idea that you would actually have the option to stay and sort of act as a militia fighting fires on your property goes back to Australia. And they actually had a program that was prepare, stay, defend, or leave early. And interestingly, we had some jurisdictions in Southern California that were looking at adopting this policy. But unfortunately, 2009 Black Saturday bushfires, they had 173 fatalities. And many of those fatalities were people that decided to stay and defend. And so the jurisdictions that had been looking at that as an idea quickly dropped it. All the material got thrown in the round file. And California in general and across most of the United States, the Ready, Set, Go program became the adopted policy and stance of fire agencies. And how many people are familiar with Ready, Set, Go? Pretty much everybody. Good. So Ready, Set, Go generally emphasizes the need for leaving early. That's the whole concept of Ready, Set, Go. And there's a huge amount of effort that's put into the ready component of it and the set component of it. That's really the vast focus right now from the fire agencies is being prepared before the event, because we know that there's so many challenges once the event happens. So the key thing with Ready, Set, Go is knowing when to leave. And what you've heard already this morning, there are so many variables in that equation. And then obviously knowing where to go. And again, being familiar with your local community and having these types of evacuation plans with your community are so important. And then how to get there to prevent being caught in smoke, fire, and road congestion. And so you saw from that little video clip, you can imagine if you were stuck on that roadway when all that smoke and embers are flying across and what type of visibility issues that you'd have. But what we see in the reality, so it's one thing to have the Ready, Set, Go pamphlet and do the training and attend lectures where people talk about it and have firefighters explain it to you incessantly. But what we find out in reality is there's actually two types of go that we're experiencing broadly across the Western United States on these wildfire events. And so there's the leave early go, all right? This is where you have a lot of time. The fire is nowhere near your community, and you've gotten proper notification very early on, and you actually have time to think about it. And you can actually even debate with your family, like, should we not? No, I think we have a lot of time. But hey, let's start thinking about all those things that we've talked about. And I'll give you a very prescient example of this leave early go where you have all of this time. And that would be the experience of the Thomas Fire in Santa Barbara County. And it's super important that Santa Barbara County qualification there, that's the key to this, because the other go, which is the no notice, immediate, like literally woken up in the middle of the night, it's time to go, there's fire, it's gonna hit your neighborhood in 10 minutes. So this is the experience that Ventura County had on that very same fire. So when the Thomas Fire started, it was under Santa Ana wind conditions, extremely fast rate of spread, and literally burned into several Ventura County communities, including the city of Ventura, and was burning thousands of homes within the first 30 minutes to an hour of the fire. Barely enough time for all of those notification systems to get put into place and for people to get enough time to evacuate the way that they'd probably imagined they would in their heads. And so it was a very rapid evacuation, literally grabbing just the clothes on your back and getting into your vehicle or running out on the street and getting away from heat, smoke, and flame. So just a quick reminder of Ready, Set, Go. So the most important concept with Ready, Set, Go is the ready. So this is all of the things that everybody should be doing to their homes to harden them so that they're more resistant to ignition. And all of the defensible space stuff that you do to your yards and your properties to reduce the intensity of fire as it gets into the area immediately surrounding your home. It makes your house more survivable if you're stuck there, and it also creates a much safer environment for firefighters if they're going to defend your structure. So the ready part is something that we all know as Santa Barbarans, that this is something if you live up in the foothills or in remote areas and you have that space around you with wildland vegetation, this is something you're doing every spring. People are doing it right now, weed whacking the dry grass, raking all the oak leaves, cleaning out the gutters, blowing the leaves off the roof. This is all of that preparation you do in the spring. It takes days and days and days, but it pays off in spades. The second part of Ready, Set, Go is the set. And so kind of some of the things we're talking about today go into the set. This is having that evacuation plan with your family, discussing with your family what you're going to do, where are you going to go, what are you going to grab, putting together your go bag, doing really important things like having all of your important documents scanned and put somewhere out in the cloud. So we're really lucky right now in this era that we live in, because all your photos and all of your important papers can actually be saved somewhere remotely in the cloud. Back in the old days, if your house burned down, it probably meant you lost every single picture and you lost all of your documents. And so that's a huge advantage we have. The set is a vital component to Ready, Set, Go, because it is what is ensuring that you are able to evacuate as efficiently as possible. So if you're in the Ventura County Thomas Fire scenario where you only have 10 minutes, hopefully, if you've done the set properly, you know where your go bag is, you know what you're gonna grab, your family knows what to do. Maybe you've got kids that are in school or somebody's at work, but you've all talked about the rally point and where you're going to go and what the process will be. And then, of course, the last is the go. And this is super important things like, are you signed up for the alerts? Are you paying attention to the weather conditions for that day and what the various circumstances are with this fire? Are you cognizant of where the fire is in relation to your community? Do you know the road system in your community? So the go is highly dependent that you've done your homework in the ready and the set. So let's say you have 10 minutes to leave. So let's say you're living in Ventura when the Thomas Fire started. Or another example that's closer to home, you're living in Montecito when the Tea Fire started. Or you're living in Mission Canyon when the Hasacita Fire started. So 10 minutes to leave. So this is the idea of the go bag, having that critical amount of emergency gear in your go bag that's going to get you through the next 24, 36, 48 hours as you've left your house and you're off in a hotel or in a shelter area somewhere. The photos on the wall. In your mind, this is kind of something I do, I know where I have an empty duffel bag. It's in a closet, it's empty, it's a big duffel bag. And so my concept is going to be somebody in my family is going to grab that duffel bag and they're going to walk down all the walls and take all the pictures off the walls and throw them in that duffel bag. Probably break some frames, but the photos will be good. Because some of those photos, I don't have them digitized, and they're old family photos, and they're really important. Important documents, know where they are. I'm guilty of this. I've got some stuff in one nightstand drawer. I've got some other documents in a dresser drawer. I've got some stuff in a closet. And I was just thinking as I was gearing up for this lecture, I probably should have all of those in like one spot so I would know where to go. One of our folks here on the council brought up the dirty laundry hamper. And I was like, what? Why would you want that? Well, it kind of made sense because I'll give you an example. My 17-year-old, his dirty laundry hamper is always full because he's 17. But all of the clothes that are in it are the clothes he wears all the time. In fact, he goes in and grabs clothes out of it and puts them on. So if you have your dirty laundry hamper, that's probably the clothes that are important to grab. And the stuff that's in the closet that like has dust on it because you never wear it, it's probably okay if it burns up. Pets, super important. Remember your pets. Cats, dogs, birds, you name it. These are important members of your family, so don't forget your pets. All right, and then don't leave doors, windows, garage doors open if you can't find your cat or your dog, hoping that maybe they'll come in through the garage door. You just opened up a pathway for embers, and you're probably going to come back to a burn-up home. So the pets usually will figure out what to do. If you can't find them, and if they've bailed off, they're pretty fleet of foot, and they'll probably figure out what to do. They have an instinct to go away from fire. So they actually kind of understand that whole set and go part of ready, set, go. And so again, it's super important that when you leave your house, you close the windows and doors. Absolutely close everything up in your home before you leave. All right, and let's talk a little bit about pace planning. So this is something firefighters do constantly. This is how we plan our tactics on fires. This is a concept that is from the military, and wildland firefighters we're great at grabbing little snippets from various organizations, mostly the military, because they really apply well to the type of environment that we work in. But this can apply really well to evacuation planning. So primary is, you get the notice from Ready SBC Alert. You have an hour before you really feel like you're gonna have to go. You're able to pack everything up. You get the house all ready. Maybe even you have time to go out and water down the outside of the house and get everything set for what's coming. And then you're able to drive out of your community and go to wherever you've pre-designated you're going to go. Maybe it's a friend's house, or you're going to go get a hotel room somewhere. That's your primary plan. You've worked this out with your family. Everybody knows the rally point. Everybody has their roles, and everybody engages in this without panic. So alternate may be, well, we had a pre-designated rally point, but wouldn't you know that rally point is actually even closer to the fire than what we thought? Because again, fires are spatial. They might be coming from the east, like the Thomas Fire did. It might be coming straight down the mountain, like the Painted Cave Fire, or it might be a fire behind Goleta that's spreading to the east. And so you may have a place you've told your family that you're going to go, but that might actually not be the best place to go. So you'll have an alternative plan. Contingency is, well, the primary and the alternative plans, they're out. For whatever reason, those plans are no longer valid. And so you have a contingency plan where you have identified this with your family that, hey, if the primary and alternate plans don't work, our contingency is going to be like, well, we're going to do this rapid evacuation, and we're just going to get down the mountain, and we're going to go to the beach, right? Probably the safest place in a wildland fire, go to the beach. Emergency is all your planning went out the window, either because you didn't have enough time, or you didn't leave soon enough, or you just made a bad decision, and now you're stuck. And typically, in a fire, an emergency plan is typically shelter in place. For wildland firefighters, we term this that we are going to go into our safety zone and abandon the work product that we're doing and get out of harm's way. So some challenges of delayed evacuation. When you leave early, typically everything's going to be in your favor. But as you wait longer and longer and longer, either because you've literally waited too long or the fire didn't give you very much warning, it didn't give you very much time, you're going to have some challenges. And when it comes to your evacuation routes, this is probably where you're going to have the most issues, right? We don't have a great transportation network in Santa Barbara. I mean, that's just a fact. It's an old community. Literally, fire trucks were smaller when they built all these roads. Fire trucks are probably 2/3 larger than they were back in the 1950s when a lot of these road systems were getting designed. And we just have a lot more people living on the South Coast. And so our transportation network's really not set up to do these mass evacuations. And so traffic's going to be a huge issue. Even once you get out onto freeways, you could see issues like this, where you're just stopped in your tracks and watching a fire burn closer and closer and closer to the area that you're stuck in a traffic jam. This picture's from a fire that was down in San Bernardino, and literally, after this picture was taken, the fire started burning up cars that were stuck on the freeway. It was kind of a dramatic event. And, smoke and flames. And so this picture is a pretty good representation of what it's like to drive through the fire. So you'll have massive amounts of embers. You'll have smoke that drifts over the road. Your visibility would become extremely compromised. And it's not uncommon to have zero visibility. And when that happens, you cannot progress forward with the car. You have to stop where you're at, or else you're going to drive off the road. And then downed power lines. So if you're trying to get out through an area that's already been burned, this is a pretty common occurrence that happens all the time. All right, so what about sheltering in place? Well, there are some significant challenges with sheltering in place, and this would be where you are stuck sheltering in your home or in some type of structure. You can't get out, the evacuation routes are compromised, fire's already in your neighborhood, and you need to go somewhere to shelter away from the intense heat of the fire. And so defensible space becomes the primary consideration. Is the home, the structure that you're at, does it have adequate defensible space? And then the structure flammability. So if you're going to shelter in a structure, you would hope it doesn't look like this house that you see here. I don't think that house is even there anymore. I think it got bought and rebuilt and doesn't look like that. But I always use this picture as sort of the example of like kind of the structure hardening nightmare. Like essentially the only way to harden a structure like that is to take it down and rebuild a new house. But this is really common in the mountain communities. And so if you're in a home like that, it's gonna ignite pretty quick. And then exposure. So this is a big deal if you live down in the foothills where your housing development is denser. So a lot of folks in Mission Canyon are in this situation where if the fire transitions into your neighborhood and begins to burn multiple homes, the amount of radiant heat that's put off structure fires is intense, and it burns for a long time. A lot longer than the walls of your home are going to be able to withstand. And so you'll probably be faced with the really, really difficult choice as your home starts to burn with you in it. At some point, you have to get out of the home and get out into the open area. And once you do, you're in that environment. And you can see these firefighters, well, they're dressed up in all of their protective gear, and they've got charged hose lines, and you can see they've still backed off quite a bit from these burning homes because of the amount of radiant heat. So some considerations if you are stuck in your shelter. So this is evacuation survival. You can't get out. You are stuck in a structure. This is the reality that you're now facing. So the structure itself, how flammable is it? As you can see in this picture here, this home is beginning to ignite. If you are inside that home, you may not even know that that's beginning to occur. If you're in that structure, you need to stay calm. It's actually one of the fire orders that all wildland firefighters have to memorize and regurgitate endlessly, is staying calm. Because you can't make effective decisions if you're not calm. Make sure you gather your family. Make sure you know where everybody in the house is. Use your cell phone to call 911. You might get through. And that gives you the opportunity to tell the dispatcher where you are and what's happening to you. Fill all your sinks and tubs with cold water. Keep your doors and windows closed but unlocked. And a little thing you want to do with your windows, don't have like curtains shut, because anything flammable on the inside of the glass is going to get really hot from the radiant heat. And then stay inside, away from the outside walls and windows. If the home ignites, you want to exit to clear areas such as the street. And there's a timing component here. So quite a few firefighters have sheltered up inside structures when the outside environment became untenable. This happened on the Hayesacita fire behind Mission Canyon in 2009. There was 6 firefighter entrapments on the second day of the fire. They all occurred, as many of you know, there was a significant wind shift. Sundowners began to influence the fire and pushed it from the mountain down into the Mission Canyon residential community. And multiple engine companies that were protecting these homes wound up having to shelter inside the homes as the fire burned through the landscape around them. In one particular entrapment, 2 firefighters had significant burns because they essentially had to go from room to room to room as the house began to catch on fire. They got to the last room, which was a bedroom. It had a sliding door to the outside. And as that room started to go, they realized they had no choice. They had to go into the outside environment, which was surrounded by chaparral, and it was still burning off. It hadn't completely burned off. And so it's the survivability of that area outside the home is super dependent on what type of vegetation surrounds it. So if you are at a home that is surrounded by dense vegetation, you haven't done your defensible space, this is where you're going to have a problem. When you go out into that environment, it might not be survivable. So let's say you did manage to get out in time. You're in your vehicle. Now you're trying to get down the road. This is a scenario that happened to hundreds of people up in the town of Paradise on the campfire. And I'm sure a lot of you know what happened. The entire town burned down. And many, many, many people were caught trying to evacuate. And there was some loss of life from vehicles that caught on fire when they were trapped on these highways. So this is a pretty good shot of what the difference between just a few feet of where you are on the road. So this particular vehicle is parked on the fire side of the road, right on the shoulder, and you can see that vehicle is already starting to ignite. It looks like some tires are on fire, and then where the fire's hitting it, it's starting to ignite the top portion of the vehicle. So if that vehicle was parked on the other side of that highway, possibly may have had a bit better chance to survive. Vehicles will provide some protection for a limited amount of time until they don't. They'll typically sort of catastrophically fail. Typically the windows will blow out. So again, most important thing, stay calm. So now you're in your vehicle, you're stuck, you can't get down the highway, it's blocked, maybe it's power lines, maybe it's flames crossing over, or the smoke is so thick that you can no longer see, and you have to stop. So stay calm, park in an area clear of vegetation. So that's the most important thing. Our natural reaction is to pull to the shoulder and park, but if you're stuck on a fire, try to be in the middle of the highway in the widest area possible. If you're on a mid-slope road, so this is like Highway 154, right? Which is on the mid-slope. It's got an upslope side of it and a downslope side. So it's super important to know which side of the road is the fire on, which way is the fire burning. And in general, if you're on a mid-slope road, it's better to stop on what we call an out turn as opposed to an in turn. So an in turn is where the road kind of goes into a gully or a drainage or a creek or just an indentation in the topography. And an out turn is where it kind of goes around like a ridge, okay? And the reason that an in turn is more dangerous is because, as Nick described in his presentation, the heat and smoke and flame tend to funnel through all those gullies and drainages. And you have a little bit less intensity on ridge lines. Firefighters actually use ridge lines quite often when they're attacking a fire as a more advantageous place to do their fire attack. So if you have the choice, pull onto that out turn. If you can, pull up against the cut bank as long as it's devoid of vegetation, because that will give you a little bit of a shield from the heat that's coming up the slope. Obviously, close all your vehicle windows and vents. Cover up with some kind of wool blanket or a jacket. I don't know, most people don't drive around with a wool blanket, but if you do, wool blanket's good. And lie on the vehicle floor and use your cell phone to call 911. Again, if you get through to the dispatchers, they're going to prioritize what's happening to you and try to get a fire resource there. All right, so in any circumstance where you're preparing for a wildfire, and there's a potentiality that you may not get out of your home or your property. And this is especially important for people that live in rural areas, or just by the nature of how far you have to get through windy, narrow roads, that you have a higher likelihood of not being able to get out. You need to be considering what you're wearing just the same way that wildland firefighters do. So wildland firefighters don't fight fire wearing shorts and flip-flops. They've got big, heavy leather boots, and they've got thick clothing that protects them. They have a helmet. They have eye protection. So same thing. If you're, as part of your set, you haven't left your home yet, change into some appropriate clothing so that if you do get caught, you have a little bit more protection. And so some things to wear. Sturdy leather boots. Any pair of hiking boots is fine. So anything that you would normally wear going out on a hiking trail. Long pants, wool or cotton or silk, not any kind of synthetic. You don't want to wear synthetic fabric. Some kind of head protection, and mainly this isn't like head protection like firefighters have, a helmet. Probably you don't need to worry about somebody smacking you in the head with a hand tool, but you do need to worry about embers. And so if you're wearing some kind of hat, that's going to help out a lot, deflecting those embers off of your head. And then if the smoke is getting to you, you can use a bandana or a handkerchief, but you want it to be dry, not wet. And that will help somewhat to alleviate some of the intensity of the smoke you're breathing. You're going to want some kind of eye protection. It's almost impossible if you get into that super thick smoke situation to see it all. You'll have a very difficult time keeping your eyes open. And then a long sleeve shirt with a collar that can protect your neck, and leather work gloves. You don't want to wear, do not wear, open-toed shoes. Don't have a wet bandana. The reason behind that is that if you get a particularly hot little blast of air and you have a wet bandana, it'll steam the moisture on the bandana and can actually kind of singe your lungs a little bit. So it's better to have a dry bandana rather than a wet one. And then no synthetic fabrics. All right, so some challenges. You've seen a lot of good stuff today about what government does to help communities be more prepared, and all the different programs that we have. But government would readily admit to you that there are significant challenges with evacuation. So, full disclaimer, I borrowed these slides from a presentation that was done at an evacuation workshop after the Paradise Fire. And so these are from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And I'm just grabbing a couple slides from their presentation, but they did an awesome overview of lessons learned from the Paradise Fire. And essentially, they started out with distilling what the problem actually was. What is the actual problem that we're dealing with in evacuation? And addressing the life safety risk when there is insufficient time to evacuate out of the community. That's like the most pressing issue that we have with evacuation, is just the lack of time. Constantly battling insufficient time to prepare, to do the set part of Ready, Set, Go, and to actually get in your vehicles or transportation method that you have and get out of the area. And because of that, because of the fact that people are usually behind the curve when it comes to getting out of these communities, we have these documented and tragic cases of burnovers that are occurring with civilians. We've had burnovers with wildland firefighters going all the way back to the 1910s when we actually created the art of wildland firefighting. So even the professionals, year after year after year, have burnovers, and many firefighters have injuries resulting from those burnovers, and we've had tragically many fatalities of wildland firefighters. So even the experts that do this as a profession find themselves caught off guard in many circumstances. So it's asking a lot for untrained civilian population to avoid that same pitfall under those same circumstances. So burnovers is a huge issue. And then the last piece of this is that the existing built environment, so buildings, our road system, our power lines, they're not designed in any way to act as shelters from fire. So it's a huge problem that we have, is designing our system to compensate for the first bullet point. Another great slide that I found is, why is it so hard to reliably predict evacuations? And you can see it's similar to what Nick showed, the time wedge, that every step of the way we have uncertainties. And these uncertainties, they compound. So we have weather forecasting. We're pretty good at it, but we're not perfect. There's still times when the weather conditions do what they do, and we didn't predict it well enough. Fire behavior. Fire behavior is very elusive. We've got a lot of science built around it. We have a lot of good models, but it's a super dynamic phenomenon, and it is difficult to predict fire behavior. The time before the fire impacts the community. Again, that goes back to fire behavior. There's so many variables that can either delay the fire spread or accelerate the fire spread. The ability of the agency having jurisdiction to notify and make those evacuation decisions, right? So there's a time delay in that little piece of this, right? And then the challenge of civilian evacuation decisions, like people actually have to decide to do this. And so that's a delay in people's thought process. And so each one of these uncertainties compounds. So mitigating civilian fire exposures during evacuation. So if we look at this column, this represents the ideal situation. Early out, we follow Ready, Set, Go. We follow a comprehensive evacuation plan, whether it's your community's plan or a broader county plan. And even given these ideal situations, we still have challenges, right? We have challenges with public education. We have challenges with clear messaging and notification for early out versus shelter in the community. That's just the nature of technology. You know, the systems that we have sometimes break down just because of lack of cell signals. So enough time to fully evacuate before the fire impacts the community still has challenges. In these columns, this represents where we do not have enough time to evacuate. And so we can reduce the risk by mitigating the potential hazard presented by the fire. And this is things like doing fuels management within your community, along your road systems, defensible space for your structures. And we have challenges with those programs. Some of our road systems just do not have proper access. The roads are just not wide enough, and there's only one way in and one way out. And that's just the nature of the built environment. We have environmental considerations. So anytime we're doing some of these types of mitigation projects, we have to take into account impacts on the environment. And so there's a balance that we have to go through with every type of action we take. And then maintenance. This is a big one. So I know a lot of people in here live in communities that have networks of fuel treatment surrounding you. But you probably notice that sometimes they're maintained and sometimes they're not. And in some years we get a lot of rain and the grass grows tall, and you're probably wondering, when is the hand crew going to come and deal with this? And so maintenance is always a challenge. And then in this last column, this is kind of like the emerging sort of new concepts that a lot of fire practitioners and policymakers are dealing with right now. And it's this idea that you create distributed safety zone system or temporary refuge areas or community refuge areas to give people an alternative location to go to that would be safer than being stuck on the highway or stuck in their homes. And this really came out of some of the experiences that happened up on the campfire in the town of Paradise. And so the challenges to that, to creating these community refuge areas. So there's access issues, there's property issues, there's finding a place that's big enough to create these types of zones. Design guidance, so this is kind of a new thing. We don't really know exactly how big an area needs to be considered a safety zone. Obviously there's environmental considerations, there's maintenance, so if you design an area that's your refuge, who's going to maintain it? And then of course public education. So, all right, we're almost done. So we're going to look at a couple of slides and just walk through visually, would these areas be sufficient if they were your area of refuge of last resort? You can't get out to the area that you thought you were going to go to. You're stuck in your community, but you know that there's some areas that you could maybe go to that would be better than the house you're in. And so this is an example. This is a pretty decent shelter area. It's devoid of surface vegetation. You do have the row of trees, so depending on what kind of trees those are, they may be flammable, but they may not be. And so this would be a location that could, in certain circumstances, be considered a temporary refuge area or an emergency shelter area. But you're only going to fit so many cars and people in there. And so that's a problem with something this small, is it may only work for one group of people, but not for the broad community. Looking at kind of aerial imagery of commercial districts. So there's a couple shopping centers that you see here, but obviously a whole lot of fire happened. And so looking at these large parking areas, you have to ask yourself, well, how much heat came off these burning buildings, and would this parking lot have been big enough to shelter into? And in some cases, it can be. But again, this is such a dynamic environment in a wildland fire. And then when you add tons and tons of structures burning, what seemed like a huge, gigantic parking lot might not be a safe place. The Paradise Fire, large group of residents and firefighters refuged in a huge parking lot next to the grocery store, and they survived. It was miserable for them, smoky and millions of embers, but they survived. And so I think the key takeaway for some of these ideas is know your community. Like, do you have a big wide area anywhere near your community where something like this would be your last resort survival? Again, when you start to hone in, you can see that some of these areas, a ton of vehicles caught on fire. So like pretty much every vehicle in here looks like it burned up. Same along here. So in this parking lot, looks like a pretty big parking lot, but with all of these structures that burned, the amount of heat was so intense that you can see burnt vegetation in these little planter islands and burnt cars all over the place. So highly doubtful that this would be a place that you'd want to be. Same with this picture. So this is before the fire. You see this big, nice green field. But now look what happened when this area burned. So this row of trees that you see here, those all burned. And then you can kind of see discoloration on the green grass all along here. And that's the impact of that radiant heat on that green grass. So this may have been survivable right in the middle, but it would not be a comfortable place to be. And again, shows the challenges of identifying these types of areas. And here zoomed in, you can really see this field, very green, you know, it's a irrigated grass, huge lawn, and yet you can see how much discoloration there is on the grass from all of these burning structures. And then just a couple out-of-the-box refuge areas that you can see in here. So this is sort of an open space area. Looked like it was kind of green, but it burned. You can see all that black area there. The fire crept through all that grass. Here you have a big gravel lot, and that looked like a pretty safe place. This is a skate park. It's probably a great place to hang out. And here's a pool. People ask about pools. Always remember, yes, you could get in the pool, and from the neck down, you'll probably be pretty good. But from the neck up, you're going to take just as much heat as if you weren't in the pool. So pools, it wouldn't be my first choice. I guess if everything was on fire and my clothes were on fire, I'd jump in the pool, but it wouldn't be like anything that I would put into my plan unless, in this example, this pool has a big, wide, area around it, and so that probably would be pretty safe. So emergency refuge areas, when and why. So again, this goes back to the PACE planning. This is your final last option, your emergency plan. You've gone through primary, alternate, contingency, and nothing's left. And so having an idea, do you have some kind of area in your community that you could go to that would have less exposure to the wildland fire than the house that you're in? And the answer may be no. The answer may be no, my house is actually the best spot. I've got really good defensible space. I'm staying here. I'm not going to get out on the street. There's nowhere I could go that would be better than where I'm at. And that's a decision only you can make, knowing your home and your risks. All right, so we're going to do a quick little video. And this is a father and a son that were evacuating from a fire. And it's a pretty good example of how things can rapidly deteriorate as you drive through the fire. So I think the main thing that I take away from that video is that the father did absolutely the right thing in trying to maintain calmness in his son who was driving. They'd already made the decision to go down that road, right, wrong, or indifferent, so they were stuck. I mean, there's no way to turn around. At a certain point, they couldn't even back up or get away from it, so they were kind of on a predetermined course. And really, the only option that they had was to stay calm as long as they possibly could. And avoid panic, which would then potentially cause them to make decisions that were not in their interest. For example, getting out of the car at that last moment would not have been a good plan. They did need to stay in the car, and they probably needed to continue driving down that road to try to get out of the burn area. They made it out, yeah, because we have the video. So. We would not have this video if they didn't make it out. So yes, they survived, they made it out. But I've driven in those conditions many times, and it's nerve-wracking. So I've actually driven through conditions where I kind of had about 20 feet of zero visibility, and I took it on faith, like, don't turn the wheel. I know the road's straight. I know this road really well. I just need to go 20 feet, and I'll get out of this. But, that's not a happy place to be in. It's not a happy place to be on a road that's getting burned over. It's a dramatic experience. So hopefully that kind of gives a mental image in your mind of what that looks like. All right, I think that's the last slide, right?